She thought the messages meant loyalty until they were read out loud. What began as private words between best friends slowly revealed a trail of manipulation, control, and betrayal. How much damage can a conversation really do? And when trust becomes a weapon, who is truly responsible for the outcome? This is a story where every text carries a consequence. For viewers who appreciate serious, documentary-style crime storytelling, we invite you to subscribe. Each story is thoughtfully researched and presented to highlight the emotional and moral weight behind every decision. March 14th, 2019 began like any other weekday, wrapped in the soft anonymity of a quiet suburban street. Lawns were still wet with morning dew, cars idled briefly before disappearing toward work, and nothing in the air suggested that this date would later be replayed, slowed down, and analyzed from every possible angle. For her, it was supposed to be ordinary. Routine has a way of creating safety, and that illusion held firm until it didn't. The first disruption came not with sirens or raised voices, but with a phone placed gently on a table. What had started as a routine inquiry unfolded calmly, almost politely. A request to review messages. A pause. Then silence, the kind that stretches too long to be ignored. The documentary lingers here, letting viewers sit with the weight of that moment, because this was where the ground first shifted. At a glance, the messages seemed harmless. Familiar names, inside jokes, reassurance exchanged between two people who had known each other for years. Nothing overtly threatening, nothing criminal on its own. But investigators don't read messages the way friends do. They read between the lines, measuring timing, tone, and repetition. And slowly, a different story began to surface. Certain phrases appeared again and again, arriving late at night or during moments of emotional vulnerability. Words that sounded supportive but carried an undercurrent of pressure. Encouragement that subtly redirected choices. Concern that quietly undermined confidence. The documentary narration avoids judgment, instead allowing the pattern to speak for itself. What looked like care began to feel like influence. As the messages were scrolled through, her body language changed. Shoulders tightened, breathing slowed. This wasn't shock in the dramatic sense. It was recognition. The realization that something familiar had been wrong for a long time, hiding in plain sight. Trust doesn't usually break all at once. It erodes grain by grain until one moment makes the damage impossible to deny. The camera cuts to still frames of the conversation logs, blurred just enough to preserve anonymity. Dates, timestamps, gaps. Each one raises quiet questions. Why here? Why now? Why so often? The answers are not given yet, but the unease is unmistakable. By the end of that morning, the routine was gone. What replaced it was uncertainty and the first crack in a friendship once believed to be unshakable. The documentary steps back, preparing to rewind time, because to understand how a few messages could carry such weight, one has to understand the bond that made them matter in the first place. This case does not begin with a crime scene, but with a relationship built slowly and trusted completely. Before suspicion, before scrutiny, there was history. Shared milestones, late-night confessions, and a belief that loyalty was unquestionable. To make sense of what unfolded after March 14th, the documentary must step further back, into the origins of a friendship where boundaries blurred long before anyone noticed. That past holds answers the present refuses to explain fully yet. To understand how those messages carried such weight, the documentary rewinds years before March 14th, 2019, to the beginning of a friendship that appeared effortless from the outside. They met at a moment when both were searching for stability, and what formed between them felt immediate and comforting. In interviews, people close to them described the bond using family language. They weren't just friends. They were sisters, at least in the way they presented themselves to the world. Early memories are reconstructed through photographs, archived messages, and quiet reenactments. Shared apartments, celebrations marked side by side, long conversations that stretched late into the night, where secrets were exchanged freely and trust was assumed, not negotiated. Over time, that trust became a constant presence, something neither woman thought to question. The documentary narration emphasizes how familiarity can sometimes replace vigilance without anyone noticing the shift. But closeness, when left unchecked, can slowly turn into dependency. As years passed, one woman increasingly leaned on the other for reassurance, validation, and guidance. Decisions were discussed, then quietly shaped. Advice blended into influence. Support became expectation. The line between care and control was thin enough to disappear entirely. No single moment marked the change. It happened gradually, hidden beneath shared laughter and mutual loyalty. Subtle cracks appear when the footage slows down. Passing comment brushed aside. A look that lingered too long. Moments of comparison that felt harmless at the time but carried an edge of competition. Friends recall how achievements were celebrated, yet somehow measured. How one success seemed to unsettle the other. Jealousy rarely announces itself openly. It prefers disguise, often hiding behind encouragement and concern. The documentary avoids assigning blame here, instead focusing on emotional dynamics. Psychologists explain how intense friendships can mirror romantic relationships, complete with power imbalances and unspoken expectations. When boundaries aren't clearly defined, influence can grow unnoticed. In this case, dependency was mutual at first, but over time, it tilted unevenly, favoring the one who learned how to guide emotions without appearing to demand anything. Reconstructed scenes show conversations where reassurance is repeatedly offered, then subtly withdrawn. Silence used as leverage. Attention given conditionally. These are not dramatic confrontations, but quiet exchanges that accumulate meaning only in hindsight. The audience is invited to see how trust can become a currency, spent strategically rather than shared freely. By the time the friendship reached its most intense phase, secrecy had become normal. Private conversations replaced outside perspectives. Doubts were redirected inward. The women told each other everything, or so it seemed. What went unsaid mattered just as much as what was spoken. That silence allowed assumptions to grow, unchecked and unquestioned. With the foundation of the friendship laid bare, the documentary moves forward into the evidence itself. Investigators return to the messages, this time isolating them from memory and emotion, treating each line as data. Screens glow in darkened rooms as conversations are stripped of context and reorganized by time. The goal is no longer understanding the relationship, but understanding intent. What immediately stands out is not profanity or threats, but timing. Messages appear precisely when emotional defenses were weakest. After arguments, during moments of self-doubt, late at night, when isolation sharpens every thought. Investigators explain that timing often reveals more than wording. Comfort offered at the wrong moment can quietly become control, especially when repeated often enough to feel normal. The documentary slows its pace, allowing viewers to absorb individual exchanges. Short sentences are replayed on screen. Pauses between replies stretch longer than expected. A reassuring phrase follows distress, but subtly redirects it. Encouragement arrives, yet always nudges toward a specific choice. This is not chaos. It is consistency, and consistency suggests design rather than coincidence. Experts describe language as a psychological fingerprint, unique not only in what it says but when it appears. In these conversations, care and pressure exist side by side. Concern is paired with expectation. Support is offered conditionally. Over time, the recipient begins to anticipate approval before acting, adjusting decisions to avoid silence or disappointment. The messages do not command, they guide. Reconstructed scenes show a phone lighting up in dark rooms, the vibration interrupting private moments. Dialogue is minimal, but the impact is clear. Each notification carries emotional weight, reinforcing reliance. The documentary emphasizes that manipulation rarely announces itself loudly, prefers familiarity. It works best when it feels earned. As investigators trace the timeline, patterns emerge. When outside opinions enter the picture, messages increase. When independence appears, reassurance intensifies. This push and pull mirrors classic influence tactics, though nothing illegal appears on its own. The danger lies in accumulation, not any single line. Language becomes a slow force, shaping perception over months and years. Her reactions, captured through interviews and reenactments, reveal growing confusion. She rereads messages searching for clarity, unsure whether discomfort is justified. The words are kind enough to dismiss suspicion, yet persistent enough to erode certainty. The documentary allows silence to linger here, emphasizing how doubt often grows quietly, without witnesses. Investigators avoid dramatic conclusions, instead presenting the messages plainly. They allow viewers to feel the unease of recognizing something wrong without being able to name it. This restraint is deliberate. The story is not about villains or heroes, but about influence exercised through ordinary language. By now, the messages are no longer simply text on a screen. They are evidence of an intricate psychological dynamic. Experts brought in for the documentary explain that emotional control often hides behind the facade of concern. A kind word, a suggestion meant for your own good, or a timely reminder can be entirely innocent, or it can be a subtle lever of influence. Here, investigators notice a pattern repeating over months, a rhythm that transforms ordinary interaction into something far more insidious. Reconstructed conversations show a consistent blend of reassurance and pressure. Phrases meant to comfort are carefully paired with implied obligation. "I just worry about you" reads as gentle care, but its effect is unmistakable. It nudges decisions, shapes actions, and instills a sense of indebtedness. The narration emphasizes that coercion doesn't always need overt threats. Sometimes it is invisible, threading itself into everyday exchanges until it becomes difficult to distinguish support from control. Psychologists discuss how repeated exposure to these subtle patterns can rewire perception. One person begins to measure their choices through the lens of the other's approval, internalizing guilt for any perceived misstep. Control becomes internalized, disguised as instinct rather than external influence. The documentary slows here, letting viewers consider the cumulative weight of small interventions, each tiny gesture layering influence onto the recipient's emotional landscape. The friends' messages are dissected further. They contain cycles of reassurance punctuated by implied disappointment. Compliments are immediately followed by critiques, questions framed as concern, and suggestions offered as if optional. The effect is almost imperceptible in the moment, but over time it shapes priorities, decisions, and self-perception. Investigators note how careful the sender is. No one line seems harmful on its own, but together they form a pattern impossible to ignore. Reenactments show quiet evenings where phones glow in the dark, each notification a pulse of emotional guidance. Scenes focus on the recipient's hesitation before responding, the subtle second-guessing, the shifting tone of internal monologue as she calculates reactions and adjusts behavior. The documentary underscores that control in such relationships is rarely violent or overt. It is a slow, deliberate force that works because it is invisible until the damage is done. The narration examines guilt as a tool. Messages express concern over choices already made, framing doubts in ways that prompt compliance. "I just don't want you to hurt yourself," one line reads, leaving the recipient feeling accountable not only for her actions but for the emotional state of the sender. It is manipulation dressed as care, a dangerous overlap of empathy and pressure. By tracing these patterns, the documentary allows viewers to see the broader psychological consequences. The recipient's mental state begins to shift subtly. Uncertainty replaces instinct, self-confidence erodes, and reliance on the other grows. What once felt like friendship now carries an unspoken hierarchy, where influence becomes a quiet, constant expectation. The evening began like any other, unremarkable in its ordinary rhythm. Streetlights flickered on as the sun dipped below the horizon, and the quiet hum of suburban life persisted, unaware of the tension quietly building inside a single apartment. Phones rested on tables, screens locked in muted anticipation, each vibration a small signal of unseen emotional currents. The documentary lingers on these details, drawing viewers into a world where ordinary moments carry extraordinary weight. Calls went unanswered. Each ring stretched into silence, amplifying uncertainty. Reconstructed reenactments show hands hovering over phones, hesitation palpable in every gesture. Messages exchanged were concise but loaded, seemingly casual lines that concealed heavy implications. The tension is slow, deliberate. No raised voices, no confrontation. Yet the weight of expectation is unmistakable. A final text appears on the screen, its timing deliberate, its tone carefully neutral. The sender offers reassurance, then subtly implies disappointment. "I hope you understand why I worry," the message reads. The recipient rereads it, eyes scanning over the words as though deciphering hidden meaning. The pause, captured through close-up reenactments and cinematic framing, stretches uncomfortably. It is a quiet, almost invisible moment, but its emotional impact is profound. The documentary emphasizes what happens next is largely off-screen, intangible yet undeniable. Nothing cinematic or violent occurs, no shouting, no breaking of objects. Yet the consequences ripple immediately. Confusion sets in first, a fog of doubt that clouds judgment. Fear follows, not of physical danger, but of relational rupture, of moral missteps, of failing an invisible expectation that has quietly dominated months of interaction. Voiceover narration explains how this is often the case in relationships dominated by subtle influence. The tipping point is rarely dramatic. Instead, it is composed of minor choices, each compounded by manipulation, until one evening encapsulates all prior pressure. The audience is made to feel the weight of cumulative tension, the emotional stakes layered so densely that any reaction feels monumental. Interviews with experts break down the psychological landscape. They describe how guilt, obligation, and fear of disappointment combine to cloud decision-making. The recipient's mind is overwhelmed, trying to reconcile care with control, friendship with manipulation. Even hindsight struggles to pinpoint the precise moment when influence crosses into irreversible consequence. The night concludes in ambiguity, a deliberate absence of spectacle. Reenactments show empty rooms, glowing screens, and small, hesitant movements. The documentary focuses on aftermath, the sudden stillness, the subtle tremor in the recipient's expression, the creeping realization that words, repeated over time, can become forces impossible to retract. In the quiet aftermath of that pivotal night, investigators turned their attention to what remained behind. Digital traces, the messages that technology refuses to forget. Deleted conversations, once thought lost, were painstakingly recovered, revealing patterns invisible to the human eye. The documentary slows, emphasizing the almost forensic patience required to reconstruct timelines, to trace intent not through loud actions but through the subtle cadence of words and pauses. Screens glow in dim rooms, displaying lines of text, timestamps, and sequences carefully mapped. Each recovered message is a puzzle piece, and as they are placed side by side, a fuller picture emerges. The narrative underscores the tension between human perception and technological memory. No effort to erase, no casual deletion, can completely remove the record of influence. Technology, it seems, keeps the story alive, even when its participants wish it gone. What emerges is a layered web of interaction. Words once deemed innocuous now reveal repetition, escalation, and implied pressure. Requests that appeared polite are reframed as strategic nudges. Encouragement is paired with silent judgment. Concern is intertwined with expectation. The pattern is unmistakable. Over time, each small push accumulates, revealing an architecture of emotional guidance that borders on manipulation. The documentary emphasizes subtlety. The messages alone do not scream guilt, but they accumulate meaning through context. One reply late at night carries more weight than a dozen casual exchanges during the day. Pauses between texts, the timing of deleted responses, and repeated phrases form a psychological fingerprint unique to the sender. Each recovered line deepens the narrative, forcing viewers to confront how ordinary communication can harbor extraordinary influence. As the investigation unfolds, the friend's carefully maintained image begins to crumble. Publicly, she remains composed, charming, and reassuring. Privately, however, data reveals inconsistencies. Promises made and quietly broken, reassurance given selectively, subtle attempts to guide choices. Reenactments intercut with expert commentary illustrate how emotional control can be exercised invisibly, using only words, timing, and the threat of withdrawal. The documentary highlights the human element alongside the data. Recovered messages evoke visible reactions in the recipient: hesitation, doubt, and a slow recognition that what felt like friendship has been shaped, even controlled, by unseen pressures. The camera lingers on small gestures: a hand hovering over the phone, a hesitant pause, a quick glance at timestamps. Each detail amplifies the narrative of influence, building tension without resorting to spectacle. Experts weigh in explaining how repeated patterns of subtle coercion become internalized. The recipient begins measuring actions against perceived expectations. Emotional dependence grows, unrecognized even by the one experiencing it. This quiet dominance, reconstructed through messages, illustrates the power of words when weaponized over time. With digital evidence laid bare, investigators moved from the abstract patterns of messages to the tangible human responses behind them. Questioning began in a neutral, controlled environment, but it didn't take long for cracks to appear. The friend, previously confident in her calm demeanor, struggled to maintain the carefully curated persona she had projected for years. Subtle contradictions emerged almost immediately, each one magnified under the quiet scrutiny of investigators and the lingering weight of recovered messages. The documentary slows, allowing viewers to observe the tension. Pauses stretch longer than expected. Words are chosen and discarded mid-sentence. The friend repeats phrases, then revises them, as if the act of speaking itself is a negotiation between truth and concealment. Experts note that this hesitation often signals panic rather than innocence. When people feel cornered, their speech patterns betray the mental strain. Each long silence becomes almost audible, a vacuum filled only by the recipient's anticipation and the camera's unflinching gaze. Reconstructed scenes show the subtle interplay of body language and emotion. A hand brushes nervously against a table. Eyes dart away, then back, seeking reassurance or an escape. Voice rises in a moment of exasperation, then falters. These visual cues, paired with the inconsistencies in spoken statements, form a narrative more revealing than any single confession could. The audience senses that control, once exercised invisibly through text, is now slipping in real time. As questioning continues, discrepancies between recorded messages and verbal accounts become impossible to reconcile. Lines that seemed innocuous on a phone now clash with the explanations offered aloud. Experts explain that such contradictions often indicate a subconscious awareness of wrongdoing, or at least the recognition that perception has shifted. The carefully constructed image of concern and loyalty begins to fracture under the combined pressure of investigation and self-awareness. The documentary focuses on emotional cues as much as factual ones. Moments of defensiveness are immediately followed by fragile attempts at justification. Attempts to redirect attention falter, leaving only raw reaction: anxiety, guilt, and flashes of anger. The audience is invited to witness the subtle human unraveling that occurs when long-standing psychological manipulation encounters accountability. Narration emphasizes that this is rarely dramatic in the cinematic sense. There are no shouting matches, no violent confrontations. Instead, the strain is internal, manifesting as hesitation, repeated clarifications, and micro-expressions that hint at truth. The contrast between public composure and private disarray reveals the depth of reliance on deception as a protective tool. By the end of the session, the mask that once concealed intention is visibly crumbling. Panic replaces poise. Explanations are inconsistent, and emotional outbursts punctuate attempts at coherence. The documentary underscores a central point. Sustained psychological control can unravel quickly when challenged, exposing what was carefully hidden. With the mask now fractured, the narrative widens to examine the broader dynamics at play. Behavioral analysts brought into the documentary note that this case is far from isolated. Betrayal often follows a predictable pattern, rooted in emotional dependence and power imbalance. The person exerting control rarely strikes violently or overtly. Instead, influence grows gradually, cloaked in kindness, loyalty, and familiarity, until the harm becomes unavoidable. Reconstructed reenactments illustrate these dynamics. Ordinary interactions, texts, casual advice, shared plans, are shown side by side with subtle manipulations. Moments of trust, previously unquestioned, now appear as calculated opportunities. Small acts of reassurance mask coercion. Attentive listening hides expectation. The documentary emphasizes how ordinary gestures, repeated over months and years, form the architecture of betrayal. Viewers are drawn into the unsettling realization that what feels natural and loving can be weaponized with precision. Analysts point to a series of psychological markers: emotional reliance, guilt inducement, and conditional affirmation form the foundation. Over time, the recipient internalizes these patterns, adjusting behavior to maintain connection and avoid perceived disappointment. Loyalty becomes a tool, trust a lever, and silence a mirror reflecting compliance. The documentary presents this with deliberate pacing, allowing audiences to see that manipulation does not always announce itself. It grows quietly, almost invisibly, within the fabric of daily life. Reenactments further reveal how trust was systematically exploited. Invitations to confide, late-night conversations, and shared secrets become vectors for influence. Each act of vulnerability is met with carefully measured responses. Reassurance coupled with subtle judgment. The recipient begins to anticipate emotional reactions, changing decisions to avoid conflict or disapproval. What starts as seemingly minor guidance gradually shapes life choices, leaving one person unknowingly trapped in a web of expectation. The narration confronts the audience with a hard truth. The most devastating harm often comes from those closest to us. Betrayal is rarely committed by strangers. It emerges within intimate spaces where loyalty is assumed and boundaries are porous. Repeated patterns of deception, when coupled with emotional proximity, leave wounds that are deep and long-lasting. The documentary slows to highlight these psychological scars, showing that the aftermath is not always dramatic but persists quietly, affecting thoughts, behavior, and self-perception. Archival footage and stills reinforce the emotional toll. Subtle body language, lingering expressions, and hesitations illustrate the recipient's growing unease. Even without overt confrontation, the consequences of repeated manipulation are visible. Behavioral analysts underscore that betrayal of this nature often leaves both parties trapped in a cycle of guilt, confusion, and self-questioning. The documentary's tone remains careful, refusing to sensationalize, instead prioritizing insight into human behavior. The room is stark, intentionally minimal, almost clinical in its simplicity. A single table, 2 chairs, and a softly humming light set the stage. No dramatics, no music to manipulate emotion, just words, voices, and the weight they carry. Investigators begin reading the messages aloud, one by one, stripped of emojis, punctuation quirks, or any attempt at digital tone. Each line stands on its own, raw and unvarnished, leaving the listener to absorb its full impact. As the words fill the room, the recipient's reactions are subtle but telling. Eyes widen, brows furrow, shoulders tense. She does not speak at first. She merely listens, absorbing a history of emotional guidance, subtle coercion, and expectation. The silence between each line stretches, a deliberate pause that forces both her and the audience to consider the cumulative effect. Ordinary words, once easily dismissed or rationalized, now take on an almost physical weight. The documentary slows its pace, drawing attention to this quiet tension. There is no shouting, no dramatic confrontation, just the measured rhythm of spoken text. Lines that seemed innocuous when read on a phone now reveal intent, timing, and pressure. The carefully curated image of friendship and care is peeled away, layer by layer, leaving patterns of manipulation clearly visible. Each exchange becomes a mirror reflecting the depth of influence exerted over time. Experts in behavioral analysis explain the mechanics behind this impact. Human cognition is sensitive not just to content, but to the sequencing and repetition of communication. Recurrent patterns of conditional support, subtle critique, and strategic reassurance can quietly reshape thought and behavior. Hearing the messages aloud, without distraction, exposes their true force. What once felt protective now feels controlling, their cumulative effect undeniable. Reenactments intercut with these readings, showing the small but meaningful gestures that accompany the silent realization. A hand pressed to the mouth, a shallow breath, a glance toward the floor. Each visual detail underscores the emotional toll without relying on sensationalism. The documentary emphasizes that harm in such cases is psychological and cumulative. It is not always loud, and it is rarely recognized in the moment, but the impact is profound and lasting. The narration highlights the weight of accountability. The sender's intentions are now visible through the pattern of words. The recipient confronts the reality that influence, once subtle and private, can have real consequences. Every choice she made in response to those messages is now framed in a new light. The power of language, repetition, and timing becomes unmistakable. Silence between lines speaks louder than any dramatic gesture could, a quiet testament to the subtlety of manipulation. The room is quieter now, though the echoes of revelation linger. With messages read aloud and intentions laid bare, responsibility is no longer abstract. It is tangible, unavoidable. The documentary shifts focus from investigation to aftermath, exploring the emotional terrain left behind when manipulation and betrayal intersect. Those affected are left to navigate a landscape marked by guilt, grief, and unanswered questions, where clarity does not always equate to relief. Interviews with the recipient reveal a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that the patterns are now visible, anger at the betrayal, and guilt for decisions made under influence. She recounts sleepless nights spent replaying exchanges in her mind, parsing each line for meaning she once could not perceive. The documentary emphasizes that recognition of truth often brings no immediate comfort, only a heightened awareness of the cost of trust misplaced. Psychologists explain that the emotional aftermath of such experiences can be enduring. Cognitive dissonance, self-doubt, and a pervasive sense of vulnerability often persist long after the external evidence has been accounted for. Reenactments subtly illustrate this. Solitary walks through empty streets, long moments of reflection in quiet rooms, fingers hovering over a phone before putting it down again. Each gesture underscores the internalized weight of betrayal. Even when accountability is established, justice feels incomplete. Investigators, now aware of intent and pattern, note that consequences can be measured legally or socially, but they rarely repair the emotional damage inflicted over months or years. The documentary highlights this contrast deliberately. Truth is quantified, closure is not. Audiences are invited to recognize the nuanced difference, understanding that transparency does not always heal, and accountability does not always console. The narrative interweaves archival footage, text logs, and interviews with experts, showing the ripple effect on all involved. Friends and colleagues who witnessed the relationship describe their own disorientation, realizing only retrospectively how subtle influence shaped behavior. Trust, once fractured, leaves an extended trail, touching lives far beyond the primary participants. The documentary emphasizes the far-reaching consequences of relational betrayal, illustrating that the human cost extends beyond the immediate circle. Emotionally, the recipient grapples with lingering questions. How could a relationship so trusted become a vehicle for control? Could she have recognized the signs earlier? The documentary allows these uncertainties to remain unresolved, highlighting that some questions resist answers, and some wounds resist closure. The silence of these unanswered questions carries as much weight as the evidence itself, leaving both the viewer and the subject with a sense of unresolved tension. The story also reflects on the sender, whose carefully maintained image has been dismantled. There is no dramatic confession or theatrical punishment, only the quiet weight of consequences, social, relational, and personal. Experts explain that recognition of harm does not erase it. Accountability, while necessary, cannot replace the subtle erosion of trust nor the emotional imprint left by months of manipulation. The camera pans across empty streets and silent rooms, echoing the quiet aftermath of a story that has unfolded over years. The documentary's narration takes a reflective tone, moving beyond individual events to explore the broader lessons embedded in the case. Trust, it explains, is a cornerstone of human connection, essential, fragile, and sometimes perilous when placed without scrutiny. What began as a relationship rooted in shared history and intimacy demonstrates how easily boundaries can blur and how subtle influence can evolve into emotional control. Experts weigh in, emphasizing the importance of clear emotional boundaries. The recipient's experience illustrates how unchecked reliance on another's guidance can erode self-confidence and autonomy. Reenactments subtly depict the cumulative impact. Small gestures, repeated reassurances, and conditional support that, over time, become invisible levers of power. The documentary stresses that even well-meaning advice can transform into manipulation if it undermines independent decision-making or exploits vulnerability. Accountability, the narration continues, extends beyond overt actions. Influence leaves traces that are sometimes intangible yet deeply felt. The sender, who meticulously curated an image of care and loyalty, serves as a cautionary example. Intentions alone do not absolve responsibility. The documentary highlights how ethical lapses, even subtle ones, can generate consequences that ripple through lives far beyond the immediate relationship. This reflection reinforces a central theme. Trust, once exploited, has enduring costs that are not easily mitigated. Archival visuals return to the digital messages, now stripped of context but resonating with meaning. Each timestamp, each carefully worded line, is framed as a lesson in awareness. Observers are reminded that technology records more than communication. It chronicles influence, intention, and the slow accumulation of pressure. The documentary pairs this imagery with expert commentary, noting that recognizing patterns of emotional control is essential to preventing harm. Trust, while vital, requires vigilance, discernment, and the courage to challenge inconsistencies before they escalate. The narration also explores the ripple effects on the wider circle of acquaintances, colleagues, and friends. Even those not directly involved feel the aftershocks of betrayal. Fractured perceptions, altered loyalties, and lingering doubt. Relationships that once seemed stable are recalibrated in the light of revealed influence. This broader context underscores that the cost of trust is rarely contained. It extends through social networks, affecting human interactions in ways that are subtle but profound. Cinematic reenactments and still frames illustrate the psychological weight borne by the recipient. Moments of hesitation, quiet reflection, and emotional isolation convey how trust, once manipulated, can lead to prolonged self-questioning and diminished agency. The documentary emphasizes that the harm is not always dramatic or visible, but it is enduring. Ordinary lives, shaped by extraordinary deception, demonstrate the quiet but devastating power of emotional influence.